Was Ahsoka really in the world between worlds? Was that really Anakin Skywalker? And does this have any connection to the Mortis storyline? Welcome to the Story Geek Show, part of the Orange Grove 55 network. Today we are talking about Ahsoka episode 5. Buckle up because today's show might get controversial. Welcome to the Story Geek Show. We've got a fantastic panel to talk about Ahsoka Episode 5. I've been giving a disclaimer periodically here that we are talking about a Disney show, but we are actually in support of the writers and actors. So just so everyone's listening, we get to use this platform to solve this thing so people can get back to work, because folks are really hurting, not just the WGA and the actors, but also all of the people who work on these productions. So I'm very grateful to SAG for having their interim agreements, because I'm going to be using one of those as we film our short film this year. And I just want to give a shout out to them for being fair to independent creators, because that's a really big deal. Bryant will know that, because Bryant's an independent comic creator. So yes, it's much more difficult to be an independent person in these streets than it is one of these big studios. But I mentioned Bryant Dillon. He is with us today again, which is always an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us, Bryant.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be back.
Yeah, and we'll tell you a little bit more about Fanbasepress and Bryant and where you can find him at the end of this show, so be sure to listen to the whole thing. Citrus George is also with us, the creator of Citrus Corner. How you doing, George?
I'm doing good. Glad to be back on and talking some more Star Wars and Ahsoka. This one was a very interesting episode, to say the least, of where it's gonna pioneer into the next episode. So can't wait to talk about it.
We've only got 3 episodes left. Can you believe that? Just 3 episodes left. That's just like, it kind of makes me sad, because I've really been enjoying these last 2 episodes. So we'll see where this goes. OG, the what are we calling you now? The Admiral of Orange Grove 55. How you doing, sir?
I am doing fantastic. I can see my little Wi-Fi thing up there, so I'm probably coming all pixelated. But from what you can see, I am OG55. I am really excited to talk about this episode. I absolutely love it. I actually am one of the few people that I actually really enjoyed the prequels, believe it or not. I'm a big Hayden Christensen fan. So this episode, it hit pretty hard for me. But let's get started.
You were the chosen one.
Yes, we will be taking the high ground this entire episode, just trying to as we try to figure out what exactly was happening in episode 5 and why some of that stuff matters. I will tell you that my prompts and questions are mostly focused around the Ahsoka Anakin. By the way, I should mention too, as with any show we ever do with the Story Geeks, it is going to contain a massive amount of spoilers. So if you have not watched episode 5 yet, then go watch it before you hang out with us. Sometimes there's folks that are involved in us putting on these shows, and I send out the questions and the prompts, and I'm like, just don't read them if you haven't seen it, because it's going to spoil things, even in the questions that I send out. But I will say that most of this is focused around the Ahsoka Anakin stuff, because that's where a lot of the discussion is coming from. So if you guys want to branch out into any other aspects of this episode, then let me know. But I think that's mostly where the discussion is happening. So that's mostly what I've got for us today. And usually we go around the table and give a 1 to 10, like, did we like this or not? But I'm just going to ask this, and I'm going to leave it open to any of you. Did anybody not like this episode?
I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And like I said, I'm a big prequels fan. And as a prequels person, we've been eating pretty good lately. I got to be honest.
Oh, yeah.
And, eating really good. And I think Hayden, the thing with Hayden that I really appreciate is, like, he got a lot of crap during the prequels for his acting. And what a lot of fans didn't realize with that, I think, was like, and Jay, to your credit, you bring it up all the time. George Lucas is he doesn't do dialogue. You know what I'm saying?
No.
He's not an actor's director. And a lot of even Natalie Portman stuff was coming out really clunky and awkward, right? I mean, she's phenomenal. So I think it's really kind of cool to have Anakin's, like, redemption arc, so to speak, or I'm sorry, not Anakin's, Hayden's redemption arc, and kind of prove to the world, like, hey, you know what? I got the chops. And this episode shows he's got the chops. I think his acting was phenomenal in this, and I'm rooting for the guy, and I'm really glad to see him back in the saddle, because I think he did a freaking amazing job. I absolutely loved his performance in this.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, guys, about about Hayden Christensen or anything else?
I'll just add to the, you can jump on that. I totally agree. This is a 10 out of 10 episode. It was amazing. It's, you know, what I think, at least for me, it was what I hope for with each one of these episodes. Not that they have to be exactly this content, but the way that it made me feel, you know, start to finish, was just absolutely fantastic. It pushed mythology forward. It pushed the character arc forward. It made me have an experience that I've had a lot actually recently. I would agree with OG that not just with the prequels, Star Wars fans have been eaten good. As much as you hear the opposite on online a lot, you know. There are times when I've sat down with the latest episode of Bad Batch or Andor or you know, even as much as it was criticized, Mandalorian season 3, and just been like, at times, like, the teenage me who had like Dark Empire and a Star Wars RPG, like, you know, paper and was filling it out, would never have imagined, like, hey, every couple months, you know, they're going to roll out something amazing that you only imagined in your backyard with action figures, you know? Like, I mean, we do, everything deserves a, you know, a decent critique. It's fair, but the idea that there's so many of these stories out there and that we're reaching a point like this, and I'm there with OG as well. I've always loved the character of Anakin. I like the prequels. I went through a period where I was kind of like unsure about how to feel about them because of all the criticism. I've really come around on them in the past couple of years and think they're even more important and worthwhile now that they have the, you know, this different series around them. And to see someone like Hayden Christensen, who did receive so much negative attention, get a response from fans. I mean, there's been a couple things over the past years. Responses at the Star Wars Celebration, his appearances on Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then obviously this is like, I think in some ways probably a gift to Hayden. I mean, I can only think that he was overjoyed with how much he got to play with the character in this episode. I mean, that one scene where it's a flashback to one of the first Clone Wars, and we have young Anakin talking to young Ahsoka. There's so many different layers that he got to play in that one scene, that I feel like he didn't necessarily get to touch because of the story that George was telling. And I can, again, only think that that's such a gift, because not only is it awesome for us as fans, but he gets to show, not only do I love this character, not only do I understand this character, but I can do everything that I've been told I can't do. And the fan base is, you know, responding, I think, as appropriately.
Yeah, that's so true. I think it occurs to me that, like, one of the things that I've said, and I mean this with all due respect, because George Lucas, to me, you know, inspired my childhood, right? Like, so when I say George Lucas is an amazing storyteller, I think he's probably like a 2 or a 3 out of a 10 as a director. Now there should be no vitriol against George Lucas because he's not the best director. Like, he all the other things that he's amazing at make him like a staple of Hollywood Hall of Fame. I mean, the guy is amazing. Yeah. So when I say he's not a very good director, I don't mean to disparage him in any way. I for example, I wish I had his imagination, which I don't, right? As a storyteller, that's not my strong suit. We all have things that we're better at, things that we're worse at. But I do think that Hayden Christensen, unfortunately, got not just Hayden Christensen, the actor who played Jar Jar, his name is slipping my mind right now. Ahmed Best, yes, of course. And Jake Lloyd. I mean, the list goes on and on about the actors who suffered a little bit from fan response, largely because it was George Lucas directing those films. If you look at all the other Star Wars films that George didn't direct, that he was involved in, primarily the original trilogy, but they were all done a lot better. Even with the clunky dialogue, like, those were still managed more effectively than I think. And by the way, George had a lot of other things he was trying to do than tell a great Star Wars story with the prequels. Not to say the prequels were bad, not to say any of that kind of stuff, but he was pushing technology. We owe digital cameras and the popularity of digital film, despite the fact that Christopher Nolan doesn't want to use it. We owe that to George Lucas, right? Like George Lucas pushed all that stuff. The way that he did his scenes with green screen in the back and filming a lot of those things, like that was all. We owe all of what modern film is. A lot of that is owed to George Lucas. So, but he's just not the best. He's just not the best director, and some people suffered for those reasons.
You had. Oh, go ahead, OG.
Real quick, I just want to say real quick. It's funny you mentioned Jay. Like, okay, so yeah, he's a great visionary, but hey, maybe with the directing, he's not so great. It's funny, like Walt Disney. Some of his 9 old men, his animators, would get on him like, "Man, Walt, you got to really quit smoking here," because he's coughing up a storm in these animator meetings, right? And Walt turned to one of them and said, "Hey, a guy's got to have a couple vices, right? Hey, same goes for Lucas, dude. The guy's a brilliant visionary." He's got to have a couple of vices. Hey, every guy has something. So, I mean, hey, he absolutely is a legend in so many other areas. And so, yeah, he's not so good at dialogue, but I think we can forgive him. Go ahead, George.
I was just going to say, and I too enjoy the prequels. And I feel like, but every time I do watch the prequels, I can see how Lucas's vision kind of lack thereof of how he wanted. He had it in his head, but when it came time to actually execute those films, that's where it was not his strong suit. And Jay, you had mentioned the actor Jake Lloyd, and no offense to him, he is a good actor, but I feel like that he was not the role for the young Anakin, because I actually watched the casting call of the 3 young boys that was supposed to. One of them was supposed to play young Anakin, and I forget. I forget the other 2's names, but the one was actually brilliant during his run through with Natalie Portman, and it was George's call that he went with Jake, and all other people, the casting agent and everything. There was like, I would go a different route with this, and he didn't, and so unfortunately, it's sometimes those small little decisions that could make or break a film, that it could have been even greater.
Yeah,
exactly. Though I gotta say though, I got a soft spot for Jake because I had the exact same haircut as a kid, the little
nice. Yeah, I think even with Jake, and like I've seen the auditions as well, and even with that, there are choices made every moment of a story, whether you're putting it in comic books like Bryant and his crew, or whether you're putting it in film like we're going to do later this year. Every single moment is a decision, right? Like, and even if someone's performance was better in an audition, that doesn't mean the director doesn't have control over how that gets done in the room when you shoot. And so it's like, so yes, I agree, George, that it could have been the wrong choice. It could have been the wrong choice, but I also feel like a lot of directors can overcome some of that stuff. They can change lines in the moment and be like, that line is just not hitting right with this particular actor. Let's change the line. Let's shoot it from a different angle. Let's shoot somebody's reaction. Let's stay on this person's reaction instead of going to that. So, it is what it is. I think the prequels are like a lot of Star Wars. They are 10 out of 10 moments, but that doesn't always equal the most amazing content that I've ever seen. Like I love the pod race. I love the Darth Maul scenes. I love the Duel of Fates fight at the end there. But the film is not the most cohesive, great film that I've ever seen in my life, right? So it's I think one of the things that you have to do with Star Wars is you have to approach it and go, I'm going to get whatever I'm going to get because I'm not in control of it. So what do I love? What do I not love? Let's be fair about that. I do think that people take it too far. They start criticizing the actors when it's not their fault. I'm really glad you guys both brought up Anakin or Hayden Christensen, because I don't know if you guys felt this way, but I felt like when I was watching Hayden Christensen on screen, he did such a good job that he was not being Anakin Skywalker from the prequel trilogy. He was being Anakin Skywalker from the Clone Wars.
The Clone Wars.
Yeah, he was basing his role off something completely different than the role he played before, in large part. And the way he just went right into that was stunning in many regards, right? Like, so And then I also just I think her name is Greenblatt, the young Ahsoka.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's phenomenal. Like I was watching that and talk about like, you know, like I know she's a little older. She's probably in her teens. I don't know how old she is exactly.
I think she's 16 or 17. Yeah.
Okay, 16 or 17. So that's getting up into the age where it's not really a kid actor anymore if you're referring to kid actors. But I mean, the performance that she put in, again, it felt like we were watching. We've been seeing a version of Ahsoka on screen. Rosario Dawson, amazing. But that version on screen doesn't seem to be a parallel of what's in the Clone Wars, right?
No.
But when Greenblatt did the role, I was like, that looks like Ahsoka from the Clone Wars. Like that is a brilliant portrayal of that character. Now, granted, consistency with the director, because obviously this is Filoni again, so that was fantastic. But yeah, it was really, really, really magical to see all of them. And I'm not even like a Clone Wars like super fan. I like the Clone Wars, but I don't love it. But seeing that was like, that is phenomenal. Congrats to everyone.
Oh, absolutely. And one thing that I really love about this too is like, so the Clone Wars that we see in the prequels is very CGI. It's almost just it's almost completely animated. I mean, to be honest, you know, and it kind of looks it or whatever. And then we had the Clone Wars animated show, and that was obviously animated. But this is like one of the first times, I think there were glimpses of it in Mando, but where we're seeing kind of more of a real like physicality to the Clone Wars, which I really love, you know, like, I mean, there was obviously CGI in this too. I'm not, you know, but I mean, the suits are real suits they're walking around in. It's not like an animated, like everything in the prequels felt very CGI. And it was kind of cool to see the Clone Wars feel a little more grounded. And I love that about this episode. Absolutely.
You know, you're spot on, OG, because Lucas never created those suits. Every clone trooper in the prequels is a CGI character, and this is the first time that they physically built those suits for the Clone Wars. So
wow,
that's awesome. That's wild. That's wild.
You know, one thing that I'll say, I have been historically, even on this show, somewhat critical of Filoni, right? Because sometimes there's Star Wars elements that I think are Filoni. And Filoni is just like George Lucas and just like me.
Sure.
You have pluses and minuses when you tell stories, right? One thing he did that was absolutely brilliant in this episode was making the sequence of young Ahsoka seem enough dreamlike that they did not have to render the entire world. Having the smoke and then having the ships coming in and out of the smoke, absolutely brilliant. Because if they were to try to render that whole thing, it would instantly look way faker. And so whether he did that on purpose or he got lucky because it was a dream sequence, doesn't matter. It was a genius level decision because the way that it evokes emotion and puts the center focus on the characters is phenomenal. It was exactly what it needed to do. So, and that gives me hope too, because Filoni actually was on record as saying that he will not be using the volume as extensively in the film he's going to shoot as it maybe has been used in these series, because he just doesn't think the volume will work in all those circumstances. And really good on him for recognizing that and then being able to push back with Lucasfilm and say, if you want this, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to have to do it my way, right? Like that's
and that's why that's one of the things I love about Filoni is that he's not necessarily anti-volume, but he has the creative intelligence to sort of know when it's appropriate, you know? And I love that about him. You know, it's kind of like we talk a lot about attractions, like rides and stuff here on the OG channel, right? Yeah. And I think we were talking, George, the other day about this, actually, about the, or maybe, no, actually, you know what? It was Theme Park Wizard. I'm sorry, yesterday. When do you insert the media, the screens, and when do you have the physical sets, and how do you balance those, you know? And it takes a certain kind of creative to understand the appropriate percentages or whatever you want to say. Right. And I think Filoni, I feel like with that statement, Jay, it kind of gives me hope, like you as well, where it's like he understands that, like, okay, there's a proper time and place to use the volume, and then there's a time and place not to. And I feel like he understands that, and that's very encouraging. His movie, I think, is going to be an absolute banger. I think his movie is going to be an absolute banger. If it gets made, we'll see. I think it will, though. I think it will. I think it has. I think it has very good chances.
Especially after this episode. I mean, he's building up his cred. You know, if Ahsoka does well and people are talking positively, then hopefully that film is in the bag.
Yeah,
that's the only film
100%.
that they announced that I think we're for sure going to get, because it is going to be the ultimate wrapping up of this Mando-verse type of situation. So I feel like that's a stake you can put in the ground, because we are headed in that direction and it does need to be wrapped. So like, okay, so how are you going to do it? You're going to do a TV show? You're going to do a movie? I mean, you got to do one or the other. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So I have high hopes for that, but we all love this episode. I just did one thing I'll say is I did prefer episode 4 to episode 5 just a little bit. But that's majority of that is because I loved seeing Hayden Christensen. I love that 10 minutes. The rest of it for me was like, this is fine. It's moving the story forward. But like that 10 minutes was like the most amazing portion of that. That's the 10 out of 10 for me. But overarchingly, I liked episode 4 a little bit better all the way through. So.
Well, and real quick before we move on, Jay, another interesting thing about this episode too, and kind of bringing the prequels into this new era, is that one of my biggest criticisms of the prequels was how the lightsaber battles were just too like they didn't have any weight to them. It was that they're flying around, and it's like they didn't have any, like, whether it physical weight or emotional weight, whatever you want to say. These, like, the fight between him and Ahsoka was a grounded fight, right? And that's very rare, I think, in the prequel era. Like, we didn't have that. You had a lot of this, like, there's waving him around and the whole thing. And this was like, okay, we have prequel characters, and it's a grounded lightsaber fight, and that was kind of cool to see. I gotta say, that was pretty cool to see.
That was cool. That was really cool. Any other thoughts, George? You got any other thoughts about this episode in general before we dive into these specific questions?
I mean, to echo all your thoughts, episode 1 and episode 2 I liked. Episode 3 I didn't care for. 4 and 5 right now is the spearhead of the series right now, and I feel like you needed 4 to have 5, and you have 5 that is complacent to 4. So they're kind of on a equal level for me. Because, and I do agree with you, Jay, that 10 minutes of Anakin in episode 4 that runs into the back and forth between he and Ahsoka, and almost a little bit of that, a little bit of even conflict in with that as well, as he is teaching her, and showing her, everything that is supposed to be, by taking her back into the past to move on into the future. But then it also transitions of him dueling her as her master and then moving into a Sith. So that I felt was like very, where it was like it showed for her to make a decision at the end. Do you take that power and use it for the greater good? Or do you take it as turning to the dark side to have even a greater power that you just can't control?
Yeah, we're going to get into that even more, because as we talk about what that scene was meant to be a little bit and why. I will let you know, I let Bryant know this before we started. I did just before we started recording, I watched all of the World Between Worlds episode from Rebels. I skipped over all the episodes I haven't seen. I watched that one just to get some context. And that did help me understand a little bit about some of the theories that are out there. I would go, oh, okay, I see why you have that theory, because he kind of teed you up for that theory when he did this other thing in the other episode. So that made a little bit more sense to me. That was helpful. But my first question is for you guys, and this is a really interesting one because I've heard it argued both ways. But was that the World Between Worlds, Bryant? Was that the World Between Worlds, or was that something else?
I would argue that, like much of this episode, I'm going to be saying this a couple times during this episode, I think there's a lot of mystery to it. I don't know that I can say definitively, and I think that might be part of the strength, honestly, of the episode. But what I can say, at least my interpretation, is that it was meant to call back to the world between worlds and seem reminiscent. And that lends me to believe that it's either something, a part of the world between worlds we have not seen, or something on the same level, a plane of existence somewhere, that has a deep force connection. That's what I would say.
I like that. Okay, George, what do you think? Is this world between worlds?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say as Bryant, but in my personal opinion, and I could be wrong, it doesn't seem like it. It seemed like that was the route that it was going, and then they kind of threw us a curveball of saying, okay, maybe not. This is maybe something of a vision that was like within Ahsoka's own mind of how she was interpreting of how the events went on, and then it's Anakin that kind of came to her to show her some truth to it. But I don't feel like that was the full, of the world between worlds sort of thing. That's just my opinion. I could be wrong. They could throw us another curveball in the next episode that will confirm that it was. But just of what it showed on this particular episode, I'm not getting that vibe.
So, Brian, you're a maybe lean towards yes, and George, you're a maybe lean towards no. Is that
Correct.
fair?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay.
Fair. Yeah.
Cool. And then OG, you guys split the tie right here.
Yeah, I'm actually a maybe lean towards no, it was not. I'm kind of leaning more towards it being a vision. Just my feeling, like, I mean, soon thereafter she wakes up. It feels like a vision to me, but it also feels very like intentional in the sense of like what Brian was talking about, where it's purposely trying to create that sense of doubt. Like, is it really that or is it not? Right? They don't really give you like a definitive yes or no. There's just enough there to make you question it. You know what I'm saying? So I'm right now I'm leaning towards no, it wasn't. But it's possible. It's possible it was. It felt more vision-y to me though, especially when Anakin, like when he cut the pathway and then he went into that whole scene with the Clone Wars. It felt more like a vision, in my opinion. So we'll see though. Filoni is really good at this, man. This is that was such a Filoni thing, by the way.
Well, and it's interesting too because you could potentially argue, why can't it be both?
Exactly.
There's something really interesting here where I totally agree, because Jay and I were talking about this, that there is a really hard case to make that it is a vision. It feels like that when we find that she is floating in the ocean. That makes sense. But then when you start to go back to the fact that like Jason can hear the lightsaber battles, that implies that either he is able to hear the events someone is imagining in their head, which would be possible, or that he's tapping into some sort of something else that is more concrete than just someone's personal like psychosis that they're working out. And again, I think the intention is to go, well, part of this is for you to interpret, like in the way that each individual watcher does, what hits you in the right place.
Yeah.
Hey, what do you think, man?
Well, okay, so here this is interesting because the first thing I'm going to say is I am not 100% behind the idea that the world between worlds is not itself a forced vision to a degree. Now, when I say a forced vision, I'm not saying that it is not I think that we have a normal real world response, and then we have a Star Wars response. In the normal real world response, there's a lot of discussion around what is consciousness, and what happens to your consciousness when you die. What happens to your consciousness when you are on drugs? Like what these are questions that the world is asking itself, right? I tend to think that in this kind of case, the significance of the world between worlds, even if it's a vision, it is real for the consciousness of the person experiencing it. And I think that's really important because both Ahsoka and Ezra exit the world between worlds with profound understanding of what they're supposed to be called to and why they had to go along this journey together. So for me, I go, when I say it's a forced vision, I'm not saying that it's not a place that they actually went to. I'm not saying that it's not a valuable arena for them to learn through. But a couple things stand out to me as being that the world between worlds itself is more of a vision than it is a place that you go to. The first thing that comes to mind is, yes, Ezra did walk through the wall in the Jedi Temple and enter a space. That space had a lot of gates in it. Those gates were to different impactful moments in the history of the Force, let's say. But also, like, it'd be pretty... I'm not going to say this didn't happen, but like when they encounter Palpatine through one of those gates, I go, was Palpatine really there? Or was that a perception or a means by which the Force was telling Ezra to now move on with your life, right? Like, I don't... To me, that all seems much more vision-like and important to the character in that moment to realize something about what their journey means and where they're going to end up than it is like a place that they would intentionally want to go. Because I think that's the real question, is when we talk about whether or not the world between worlds is like a real place, what we then start to wonder is that a place where someone will want to go to then time travel and change what the past was or change what the future is going to be? And I go, I don't think that's what it's meant for either way. Like, what it's meant for is for the internal, both Ahsoka and Ezra learn something. They take it as a lesson from their former master, and that encourages them to behave differently coming out of that experience. To me, that is not a thing where it's like, this is a gimmick for us to get to travel through time. It's not a gimmick for people to like save each other's masters or apprentices over the course of history or change the historical record, but rather a place that is much more internal to the people experiencing it. Now, there was no gate for Ahsoka in this episode. There was no gates in the world between worlds either. And that makes me think it was more Force vision-y. But again, I'm willing to admit that I don't even know if Ezra's thing was an actual place versus a vision, but the importance was there. So I tend to think that this was the world between worlds, but the world between worlds may not be what we think it is in terms of a place for all of these things to occur.
So it's kind of like interesting, Jay. Like you touched upon a lot of interesting stuff here. Like it's almost like when people have these near-death experiences, and they go to the beyond, right? And they get taught all these things, and it's just this crazy experience. They come back with all these lessons learned. It's not like a physical place that they went to necessarily. They didn't necessarily go to this physical thing, but it was real nonetheless, and they learned stuff and they came back with all these lessons. So are you kind of like maybe saying something like that, where it's kind of like it's a vision, it's a spiritual thing where you go, you might learn, you might, and you come back and you're a better person for it or what have you. Is that kind of where you're going at with it?
Yeah, exactly. It's like because again, the one line that we get from Rebels was that this could be something where Kanan has tapped into the cosmic force or become part of the cosmic force, and the cosmic force is what is guiding Ezra through this, right? And in that regard, and Bryant, you actually brought this up on the last show because you brought up the same cosmic force type of idea. The cosmic force is not what the experience of the people on Earth so much is, but rather the bigger context, the bigger spiritual context that is what existence is, and where the force is moving through existence to a certain degree. So to me, that's one of the better descriptions, OG, is that like this is a spirit journey of sorts, and this kind of spirit journey is inherent in lots of different religions that Star Wars has played with over the historical Star Wars timeline, right? Like George Lucas started with Eastern mysticism, but he got into some Judeo-Christian thinking in the prequels about how you could set up an empire, a Christian empire that would ultimately not even adhere to its own basic tenets. So, I mean, Star Wars plays with a lens into what human beings are dealing with right now. And I think what you described, OG, is very important to what this could be. I think.
Well, and it's interesting because I feel like you're really hitting on something, Jay, because there is, it's exactly what you're saying, and it has like the Force Ghost, like a Star Wars, like I don't know if exaggeration or spin to it, or what we would definitely describe it as. But obviously, some of us believe in spirits, some of us believe in the afterlife. We don't necessarily have concrete evidence in our world. Star Wars gives us concrete evidence. Ghosts show up, they talk to you, you have conversation. They sit on logs sometimes, blow up stuff. We don't really know the rules of that universe. There's been a lot of storytelling around it, but the films themselves, for the most part, go, hey, here's kind of what these things are. Here's an idea of how maybe it works, but we don't know exactly, unless you really dive into some of the side stories and novels and speculation among fans. And this is sort of the same. And I think that's why it works, because it's kind of playing off of the same use of the mythology for Star Wars, where everything you say, I think, entirely makes sense. I think there is, for me at least, there's something a little concrete to hold on, that something does exist here, and the fact that like Ahsoka can be pulled out of a place in the past and return to it and at a later time. All right, so there is some sort of supernatural thing going on here. It's more than just like imagination, but it does feel very visiony, and the idea that the world between worlds is not a physical place, that we don't actually go there, and that it's less powerful or different than what people believe it is. I think all seems entirely like hitting the nail on the head, because it sounds very much like what we have heard about all of the beliefs around the Force, and the way that they keep it somewhat vague so that it works as a modern myth and it's universal for all of us. And the last thing I'll say is the biggest, I think, evidence for this is what you're saying is, though, conversations we have from Yoda in Empire Strikes Back about the fact that we are not our physical beings, that we are more than that the Force is more than that if you get stuck in the idea of the physicality, that you're lost, that you're stunting yourself. This is clearly an enlightenment that it speaks to certain Force users. Maybe it's some magical realm that you can access at certain points. Maybe the cosmic force is guiding it in a certain way that it lets certain people, approach it when they need to. We don't need to know absolutes for certain, but I think all of the things that you're saying make a lot of sense.
Yeah. I think
I love that too. I just love that idea of like it being this sort of like this, like you said, Bryant, like this spiritual kind of experience. I just love that. That's so Star Wars. It's like so Star Wars. Go ahead, Jay. I'm sorry.
It's so sorry. Oh no, I was gonna double down on what Bryant and you have already said, which is the more inexact it is, the better, right? Like,
yes.
Like the more defined it is, and the more that it works as a gimmick, like the worse off we will be as people who enjoy storytelling, because the more you start to build lore around something concrete, the more that you start to set yourself up for, like, for example, somebody could say, okay, well, now we're going to bring back Palpatine in episode 10, and his whole purpose is going to be to use the world between worlds to do X, Y, Z. And you should go, oh my gosh. I mean, so I think that there's a component here where it goes, it's better if we don't exactly know what it is. It's better if Palpatine doesn't exactly know what it is. If Ahsoka doesn't exactly know what it is, that's better for us as fans.
And that's where the sequels, I feel, went wrong.
Yeah, to a certain degree. I mean, even saying that the cloning was like a big deal for them. Yeah, I mean, that's like. But what were you thinking in specific, George? What do you mean, like?
Just as you were saying, like when you mentioned Palpatine, it was like so it's kind of like the history of repeating itself. It's like, okay, well, how can we throw in this twist that no one would expect? But when you mentioned the form of it being a concrete storyline, and it's like you had this great antagonist within Snoke. It was like he was mysterious. No one knew who he was, who was his backstory. It was something that was just set up that he was just there, and we're following along with it. It's like, okay, we don't really know who this character is, but he's intriguing. It's like, I want to know more about him, and maybe the less that we did know about him, the better. And then they kill him off in the most pathetic way ever. And then you then create this notion that it was Palpatine the whole time, and it's like too much. It's like trying too hard. It's like when you try something too hard to try to make something work, sometimes less is better.
That's one thing, though, I respectfully disagree with George. The throne room scene in Last Jedi blew my mind. I was legitimately.
No. Well, here's the thing: the grand scope of that scene was perfect. The battle scene with the guards and Raylo was phenomenal. The intricacy of them battling, especially like in that slow motion type thing, that was perfectly fine. But it was just how they killed off Snoke. I felt like it was just, he was supposed to be this very strong sense where he actually turned Ben Solo evil, but then it was just like in a click of a finger, oh, it was so simple just to play mind tricks on him, and then he gets cut in half, and it's like it's over with. But I do agree with you, OG, that the actual battle scene was that was the best scene of the whole entire movie. I mean, I actually woke up for that scene, because the rest of the movie I kind of slept through.
Brian's heard me say this before, and I've said it a million times on Twitter, and I'll keep telling people this, because one of the things I think we can all agree on as a fandom is if you take The Last Jedi and you actually separate it as a standalone film, it's a phenomenal film. It works so well as a film, as a standalone film. The problem with that trilogy has been talked about ad nauseum, is that as a trilogy, that particular scene in that particular film sets up some decisions down the road that were clearly not shared from a vision standpoint.
Yeah, contrasting creative visions do not work in a trilogy.
Not so
ending 9 films in a series. So
they're like,
there's both film directors have fault, and so do everyone above them. I would say,
I
to
think
some
so,
degree.
Yeah. It was kind of like one of those things. Like, what if we play all this out as like ad-libbing it all, right? Like,
hey, it worked for the original trilogy, but I don't know that means you should try it again every time.
Right.
Right.
Well, it's kind of like, hey, look, you know what? I love ice cream, right? And I love ketchup. So you have JJ, who does great movies. He does. And you have Rian Johnson, who makes phenomenal movies. I'm a huge Rian Johnson fan. And both in and of themselves are great. Ketchup and ice cream are freaking awesome, right? And we can all agree on that. But do you want them together? No, probably not. So,
well, also at the end of 9 films that are beloved in that way, it's like you're doing the ketchup and ice cream, but also you're in a world competition for ice cream, flavors, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
Exactly.
The stakes are so high. What are we doing?
Yeah. Why did you wait for this film to try to catch up on ice cream? All right. So this has been a fantastic discussion so far. The next question I have. So basically, all 4 of us are sort of maybes on, was it the world between worlds? I'm with Bryant that I think that it probably was more so than others, but I'm saying that it's probably a spiritual place that is not fully understood, and therefore is not what people think it is. So it's like changing the definition of what it might even be. The next question that people are talking about, and Bryant and I actually had some tweets about this that we were talking through, was that really Anakin Skywalker? So I'm going to let Bryant go last, but I'll let you go first, George. What do you think? Was that really Anakin Skywalker?
Well, just to make myself sleep at night, I'm going to say yes, because I really want it to be the real Anakin. Yeah, I really think it. I think even if it was the world between worlds, or if it was Ahsoka's vision, I feel like he still came to her in some form, one way or the other. Like you guys were touching upon, something when you have like an epiphany or something, or if you have something where it's like what's beyond into the afterlife or what have you. I felt like Ahsoka was in a place where she was susceptible to that. And so he then came back to her in some form, whether it was the world between worlds, as you and Bryant had mentioned, that if you are vulnerable to something where, okay, then that's when the world between worlds in a way comes to you and then you accept it. Or if it is just her inside her own mind, I still think he found a way to tap into Ahsoka to be able to communicate with her. So, and I felt like and we'll probably touch upon this in a little bit, but when I mentioned earlier of how it was the conflict between Anakin within himself when it showed him as the master and as the enemy, I felt like he showed his whole perception of, okay, which route to Ahsoka are you going to choose? And I felt that was more realism than it just being, if it was just in Ahsoka's mind, her just thinking about it. I felt like he had to actually physically be there to showcase all those points.
All right. So you're a yes. It was Anakin Skywalker. OG, was it Anakin Skywalker?
Yeah, it was Anakin. Now, I agree with George. Whether it's a vision or this is a real place, it was still Anakin. So, but it just depends on what kind of Anakin you're talking about. So this is kind of where I'm going at with it. So if it was a vision, it was still Anakin, but it was Anakin kind of going through like this spiritual consciousness. Like almost like a lot of people, like sometimes they dream of their loved ones that passed away. And they believe like, okay, that was my loved one, my grandma visiting me in my sleep, right? So it was your grandmother, maybe not physically, but she was there, right? So if it was a vision, I'm kind of like, that's where my headspace is kind of going. Like it was Anakin, but he was kind of visiting her through this subconscious sort of thing, or spiritual thing. I'm sorry. If it turns out to be the world between worlds, a physical place, then yes, it was physically, I guess, Anakin. Either way, though, no matter how you slice it, it was Anakin. So there was a specific lesson that he was trying to teach her, and he was definitely trying to communicate that with her. So yeah, I do believe it was Anakin, whether it's spiritual or physical, but he was there, and it was awesome. I loved every minute.
That's amazing, Brian. I'm going to let you have the last word on this. So I'll tell you what I think, and then I do not think it was Anakin, and this is what I've been talking to people about. Now, let me just say this.
Jay.
Yeah.
Get out.
I'll see myself out. Yeah. I'll be back. I'll see myself out after my statement. So, in the Rebels episode, Ezra pulls Ahsoka out of the battle with Anakin, and that Ahsoka is a prior Ahsoka. That's not present day Ahsoka, because Ezra was actually there at whatever it was several years ago, or a year ago, or 6 months ago, or whatever it was. So he is pulling Ahsoka from the past into the world between worlds. I don't know if Palpatine was a present Palpatine or a past, but I mean, who knows? There's also the scene of Kanan where Kanan is protecting the rest of his crew, and that obviously was a past scene as well. So there is reason to think that past Anakin could visit Ahsoka, and that he could teach her a lesson. I understand that a little bit better having seen the Rebels episode now, because I go, okay, I see why people are saying this, because in the lore it would work based on what we saw in Rebels. Here's why I don't think it's actually Anakin. I do think it was probably actually Ahsoka in Ezra's experience in the world between worlds, even though I'm not super confident in saying that. It does seem like it's her, because she does go back and we see her walk back into the temple that's collapsed from when she was fighting Darth Vader. Here's my problem. If it's really Anakin, and if it's really a past Anakin, we are still seeing Anakin through the lens of Ahsoka, right? And I think that's more appropriate, because in both cases, the experience was meant to be a moment in time where Ezra or Ahsoka, depending on who's experiencing it, would have a change in character. That change in character is basically around what they need to learn to get through what they're currently experiencing. I think it's more powerful in Ahsoka's case than it was in Ezra's case, to be honest with you. Ezra's case seems more like a kind of an experience he has that he needs to learn. Like, I need to let go of Kanan and trying to save Kanan. Ahsoka, it's for her. Like Ahsoka, it's I mean, it was for Ezra too, but it's like literally Ahsoka is about to die. She's in a space where she will die if she does not fight to live, right? It's like you said, OG, where you have a near-death experience, and it's like, do you want to go toward the light or do you want to go back toward the earth, right?
Right.
And in this moment, she's trying to decide, like, this is my take for it, right? Anakin is all talking about how he trained her for battle because he trained her for a time in which battle was the prevailing idea of the day. We need to battle our way to the next stage. I think what Ahsoka is basically saying in this near-death experience is, I'm really tired of battle. Like, now I've got Thrawn coming back. Like, you got to be kidding me. Like, I'm so tired of the fight, right? Like, maybe it would be better if I just became one with the Force. Maybe I could speak to someone else as a Force ghost or do something, but I'm tired of the battle. And it's what Ahsoka learns in those moments is that she could be a Jedi in a time of peace instead of a Jedi in a time of battle. And it's just a matter of how she's going to get there. And so when she says to Anakin, like, I'm not going to fight you anymore, I think she's basically saying, I'm going to have a different perception of the world. You'll notice that it's one of the first times we see Ahsoka actually have a genuine, joyous smile is at the end of this episode. Because I think that she's realized and recognized, like, my life doesn't have to be a slog fest through, like, the next battle that comes up around the galaxy where I'm constantly saving these yahoos, but rather I can try to move towards a time of peace. Okay, so if you take it in that context, is Anakin Skywalker from that time or from the present time capable of teaching Ahsoka that lesson? I'm not sure that he is. So if he is, he's teaching it from like a backwards stance of like saying, like, I'm going to use reverse psychology on you to get you to believe this thing that even he doesn't believe. So not only that, but when we see Anakin in those moments, again, it's a vision. I shouldn't say it's a vision. It's an experience. I tend to believe it's a vision, but it's an experience that Ahsoka is dictating to a certain degree because she says to him, like, why are we in the Clone Wars? He's like, I don't know. It's your deal. Right. Like, and we see him flash to Vader in these moments, and that's her seeing him. He doesn't know that he's Vader yet, like in that context, right? Like, but she knows he turns to Vader. So she's seeing him in the Vader context going, Anakin's trying to teach me something, and yet I know what he goes on to be. So in my mind, what she's seeing is if I continue to battle and if I continue to let myself go through all of these battles, will I just end up like Vader? Will I just end up being the thing that I'm trying to avoid? And instead she goes, you know what? That's not why I'm fighting for all this stuff. I'm not fighting for it to be a continual battle. I need to live so that I can impart these knowledge so that we can turn the world toward peace. Essentially, when she says that Anakin taught her a final lesson, or when that comes up, I think it's kind of like me seeing the world through this lens that Anakin was trying to teach me in, but recognizing what the world could become is more about what me changing than him teaching me something. I've learned something from him, even though he didn't teach me the right things. And so to me, that's not, it could be like the cosmic force putting Anakin in front of her. And if there's part of his essence there, I'm okay with that. But I don't think that Anakin, either that Anakin in that moment or Anakin in the future context, I don't think he would teach her in those ways. I think she has to be seeing it through her own lens, or it doesn't quite work as well for me personally. So I don't think it's Anakin unless it's some part of his essence that the cosmic force is utilizing in those moments to kind of bring about understanding for her. So that's just my personal take. But Bryant, you have the last take. What do you think?
Well, I think your take is really fascinating. I do have a different one, but I discussed it with you online, and I've sat with it, and I find that much like the way that you feel about the World Between Worlds, I feel like I agree with more than I disagree with. But what I think is the key point again is that I think this is supposed to be open to interpretation of the viewer, and so I think we talked a little bit off recording about how this is being used as gatekeeping by a lot of the the fandom. I don't think that there is a secret truth out there about what happened and where this is. I don't think that if you watched Rebels or Clone Wars, you know more. But I also think that if you saw deeper things or other things or hints at things and have beliefs about how it plays into the Mortis story, how it plays into the Chosen One prophecy or any of that, it's meant to be like that. It's meant for you to be able to see somewhat what you want to in it. The things that I find really interesting about what you said, Jay, are the after sitting with the episode for a while, where I look at Ahsoka's journey, I think you are spot on. But it also for me mirrors exactly what the Jedi have gone through that came from the prequel era. The whole idea there is, especially in Clone Wars with what Filoni was working on with Lucas, is the idea like, hey, we became soldiers, and that's really not ever what Jedi are supposed to be. Yes. Physical combat is not the purpose of a Jedi. The lightsaber is a weapon or a tool, rather, to be used from time to time in the appropriate circumstances, but that's not what a Jedi Knight is. They are not a combatant, and I think what we're seeing here is Ahsoka deal with all the trauma of the Clone Wars and the fact that she had to be a child soldier, that she was raised during this part where the Jedi were losing the focus of who they're supposed to be, and and sort of she's internalized that. When we look at the threat of Thrawn, everything is about, I have to stop Thrawn. I have to stop these people. I have to find them, and I'm going to stop them. And what we've seen time and again with Jedi, especially with people like Luke and Obi-Wan, is that they have to come around to the idea of letting go, trusting in the living force, and living in the moment, essentially. That's part of what I think is misunderstood about the attachments belief. You can even be attached to your own suffering, to your own pain. You need to be able to let that go and deal with the circumstances as they are. And what I find really interesting is we have someone who comes in, into this vision. The version of Ahsoka is very tense, very focused, very adamant that things have to be done a certain way. We've got to be willing to give up Ezra. We've got to be willing to destroy, the key. Right. And she's clearly worried about her apprentice, who, we can say whether that's valid or not. Maybe it is valid, but then when she comes out the other side, as many are calling her Ahsoka the White, right. There is not only, as you noted, Jay, a relief of the sort of the burden that she's been carrying, but also she is no longer going, we have to stop Thrawn. She is going, we have to go. She's telling Hera, I'm going to bring my friends back. Yeah. I'm going to go find them. I'm going to bring them back. The Thrawn is not, we will deal with Thrawn. Thrawn is not the focus. We're not here to do that. And she's not using her weapon. She's using the Force to connect with other living beings, to help others. And by going inside the Purgle, she is trusting, essentially like, I'm going to trust the living Force. We could show up anywhere. We're going wherever the Force is going to take us, with the confidence that that's where we're supposed to be, And so, long way of saying, I love all those ideas. I still tend to believe that for me, it is some sort of special, version of the world between worlds, or a plane like that. It is Anakin in some form. The living Force, from what, I don't know if this is completely canon, it's in books, but from what we've read in some of the canon books they've released, when you become one with the Force, you become kind of like, part of this massive, entity. And it's almost like how some people seem to think of heaven, where you're just like at peace. You might not have full consciousness, but you're not completely gone. And some people can have the ability to pull themselves a little bit further away from that and maintain some of their personality. But it's very difficult from the way that it's explained. You have a constant feeling of wanting to go back to where you're supposed to be, where you're happy or at peace. And I think what we're seeing here is a Anakin that we've never seen before. He is at peace. He's at peace with everything, even his darker past. And I think he does have he wants to give a guiding hand to Ahsoka. I also think, just from a storytelling perspective, they probably want to give us a last moment between these two, even if it is like a version of Anakin, if not literally Anakin, like, "Hey, what's up? I got a weekend off." And the last thing I'll say about that is that one thing that I do think the Vader thing is definitely up to interpretation, but one thing that it made me think of is there was a concept from The Force Awakens where they were going to do an Anakin Force Ghost, but he would have pieces of Vader. It almost was like he was going to be fractured in ways. He would kind of like transform at times, or have like a Vader half face, or constantly be sort of marred by this. And I do think that is some of what is present here, is that Anakin, they're not going to, I don't know that we can dive too deep into like, is he redeemed? Is he not? What does that mean? But Anakin murdered children. Anakin killed a lot of people as Vader. He did horrible, horrible things. He tortured people. It's debatable and arguable that he doesn't deserve redemption. But that doesn't, I don't know that the Force does that. I don't know that we have anything in the Force that says like, oh, well, you can never come back from it, or you can never go forward. But there could be something to the idea of like, well, but this is part of him forever. Like he never completely gets to be clean of these deeds to some degree. And maybe there is something of Vader in him that he carries, continuously, even when he manifests in some form. I guess that's the one thing that I would offer with that as an alternate explanation.
I do like that. I do like that a lot, actually. It's a really good take. Brilliant discussion, gentlemen. I like that a lot. So was it really Anakin Skywalker? We may never know, but to a certain extent, most of us are comfortable with saying in some way, shape, or form there could be. I'm the least likely to say that. But there was still a fantastic discussion. I like a lot of what was being said there. Fantastic stuff. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Jay, your take on it definitely was very, very interesting.
Yes.
You're wrong, but it was very interesting.
As long as I'm interesting, I don't mind being wrong. I got three. Now, I didn't ask you guys this before we started. What time do you guys got as a stopping point?
7,
I'm
maybe?
good. Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. Like
Okay,
another
perfect.
20 minutes,
Perfect.
maybe.
Perfect. So let's just go a little faster on this one, because I really want to get to the last two questions, if we can, in the next 20 minutes. So I'll start with you, OG. What do you think about the theory that Anakin Skywalker has become the father in the Mortis storyline from the Clone Wars? What do you think about that theory? There's some people saying like Anakin has materialized and he is now the father. Essentially, is what the claim is. What do you think?
I don't think so. I really don't. I'm not on that. I'm not on that train at all. I don't know. I feel like they're not going to mess with Anakin's legacy like that. I just feel like it's a little. It just kind of mucks things up a little too much for his character and what have you. I'm just not on that train at all. I don't feel like that's what's going on with him at all.
Okay.
I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at with it. I didn't get that impression at all. What do you feel?
My feeling, just really quickly, is that if this is true, then the father is manifesting as Anakin, not Anakin has become the father.
Right.
So I would flip it around that way. I don't think it makes sense to put Anakin in that role particularly, so therefore it kind of muddies things up a little bit for me as well.
That's where I'm kind of at with it. I feel like it kind of muddies it up a little too much. Like what you were said, maybe it's the flip side of it. Okay, I can kind of see that, but nah, it's not.
Well, and also to Brian's point where he was mentioning about, taking Anakin himself, is he redeemable? Is he going to have a piece of Vader that will always live within inside of him, even beyond as a Force ghost or as another entity or what have you? I think to then title him as the father, I don't know if it would even be in comparison, that if he really does have a piece of Vader that's still inside him, is he worthy enough to even be called that. And again, I do agree with both of you. I feel like it's taken Anakin down a road where it's just like, just keep him as how he is. Like, I mean, we already got enough about him as it is. We don't have to add more layers onto it.
Yeah. I think it's just one too many layers. I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at. I love the character. I love Anakin. I love what he is and his arc and the whole thing. I think he's a really fascinating character. We're gonna get into that, I think, a little bit more and all that. But like, to go that route, I just think that's a little weird. This is my view on it. What
do you think, Bryant? You think that Anakin has become the father?
You know, I don't know. I think I'm probably the most open to it. Here's what my thoughts are. I mean, the Mortis arc in the Clone Wars seems to suggest that is his destiny in some form. I mean, what we have to take away from that for those that have not seen it is that Ahsoka embodies the daughter, because essentially her life force is used to bring Ahsoka back to life. So the daughter's life force exists within Ahsoka, and to some degree, and this is mysterious as well, to some degree, Ahsoka is special in some manner in regards to the cosmic force. We don't really know what that means, but there are hints that she has some, larger destiny. It seems like that is the same thing that we find out in the Mortis arc with Anakin, but he rejects that destiny in that arc, if I remember correctly. But does that mean that he returns to it if he becomes one with the Force later? I don't know. I guess if someone was to say that, I would say, if you're not definitive, that you say like, well, no, it's definite, like, and you're wrong if you don't think so. I think it's a fair interpretation, but I would think that we would need to know, we would have to have more. This is not what this is about. There's nothing here that suggests definitively that he is in that position. He's kind of in the area, I guess, or I believe that this version of Anakin could be in that role, but I think that is left open to interpretation. And unless Filoni or someone else has more to tell about those Mortis characters, I think, again, this is a situation where it's going to be left to interpretation, to mystery. And if we see anything in this series about that, I think it's going to be more in relation to what happened with Ahsoka and what her destiny is, than this Force version of Anakin, Force Vision or Force Ghost version of Anakin.
Yeah,
I agree. I think they'll go. 100%. I completely agree. It'll go that route. I think more with Ahsoka than they would the Anakin route. Absolutely. Go ahead, Jay. I'm sorry, brother.
No. I thought that's where I was going to end it too. Was just the same thing. Like, I think that's right on. I think there is something to say that the cosmic force, like if you were to ask me, are the Mortis characters, are they characters that live and die? I would say no. They're characters that the cosmic force is showing you as characters so that you have a better understanding of them.
Sure.
But they are the embodiment of the cosmic force. And to an extent, we see, I think, the owl in the World Between Worlds episode is supposed to be the sister, I believe. And to a certain extent, because she kind of guides Ahsoka, like you guys just said. So that I think that's kind of an embodiment there, meaning that you could kill the one character, and the one character could die a metaphoric death as you see them, but that character's not dead because that's part of the cosmic force. It just is what it is, right? So, I don't think that people take over the role. I don't think that doesn't make sense.
It's not a job. They don't put a job.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Need someone
fill
to
out an
balance
application, and
yeah, exactly right.
100,000 years.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man, you don't want to get fired from that job. I don't know what happened. You don't want to get fired. I think that we would all
great benefits though. I heard the healthcare is amazing, dude. Great benefits.
You just can't die. You can't die no matter what happens.
That's right. That's right. Based on this conversation, I think we would all agree that the episode does not leave too much to interpretation. So I'm going to go ahead and skip that question because we've all kind of said like it's kind of good to leave things open to interpretation as long as they aren't too gray. But I think there's just the right amount of gray to give us some really good discussions. So I would rather focus in on this question because this is the other thing that came up. as this episode ended, I started seeing people, some of the same people who wanted to believe that this was definitely Anakin coming back and definitely was the world between worlds. And some of those same folks, you know who you are if you're out there. You know who you are. But they were starting to talk about Anakin Skywalker. Somebody said he's the greatest character of all time. How do we not have more Anakin Skywalker stuff, right? And that caused me to think of another question. I get thinking that he's a fantastic character. Totally understand that. I think that he is. Yeah. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The part, though, that I start to become a little bit uncomfortable with is, at what point do we start to idolize him and see him in the context that he was not intended to be seen against? And so I'll start with you, Bryant, on this one, but like just to make the question even more poignant or more direct per se. You know, we don't walk unless we're complete psychopaths. We don't walk around with Hitler shirts on, right? Like t-shirts, like so. But yet this is the character. Yeah, I would hope not. Like if you're doing that, like, you know, turn your life around. But at the same time, like, I think that like there is something to say that we appreciate the character, but at what point does that become problematic, right? At what point does a fictional character become problematic? Even though, like, sure, I'm not against Vader shirts, by the way. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, though, that like sometimes the way I hear people talk about Vader, it's like, oh man, I think you like the character for what he does, but that's like what he does is crazy disturbing. So, Bryant, what do you take? Where does the line here?
You know, I mean, I think there is. You don't want to be too paranoid about it, overly, like, you know, overly parental, and I guess is the way I think of it, you know. But I think you have a valid point, and this is something. I'm a self-admitted Anakin stan. It's one of my favorite characters of all time. I absolutely.
I'm with you, brother. I'm with you on that.
Yeah, but it's interesting the people that you run into, and I like these fans for a lot of different reasons. There are fans that really just love. The ones that I kind of love, honestly, are the Anadala, fans who are just like massive Padme, Anakin, like romance fans, and just thirst after these two characters. And I think there's a lot of fun in that. But there's also just like the character of Anakin or character of Darth Vader, you can have a lot of fun with these characters. But I do think it's worrisome when people don't take in the message. The idea that Anakin is the best character is fine to have, an opinion about, like, oh, I think this is the most interesting or dramatic or a fascinating character. But there does seem to be a lot of people that like a lot of superheroes or comic book characters, I would say. Think, people like Venom, the Punisher, Spawn. Right. They have legitimate fans, but they also seem to attract some people who are attracted to simply the idea of the power fantasy. They just want to be able to have that extreme amount of power and see this character as edgy or impressive, or maybe they key into something that they don't even realize that they want, but want that ability to be respected and feared the way that these characters are. And I really just I think that to some extent that's understandable. If someone just has a basic understanding, that is a little less nuanced than others, they shouldn't be made fun of or criticized. But when it tips into something that feels more questionable, where you're wondering, like, why are you so gung-ho about this character? What are you looking for on screen as a fan, and why are you against the things that you're against? I do think that then it becomes a little bit more of an issue, and obviously if you're a parent, or if you're an older brother or whatever, an older sister, an older sibling, you might have some worry about, like, someone who's like 14 or 15 who's like, oh, I love Anakin Skywalker. He's so sexy. He's the perfect man. You're like, he's many things, but he is not the perfect man.
No.
Definitely not the perfect romantic partner. And I love both of those characters, and I kind of love the messiness of it's kind of between the lines, but I love the messiness of Anakin and Padme, which is just like, well, we're like these really together people, on paper, like a Jedi and a senator, but behind the scenes, we're just hot messes, and we're like, can't resist each other. And it was, even though, we're doomed. I love that, but it's not aspirational. It's not what you're supposed to. You're not supposed to be like, that's love. That's what I want.
Right.
Anakin is one of the most fascinating characters. I mean, I would agree in terms of like when people say he's one of the more interesting characters in Star Wars. Absolutely, very interesting character. But when people get into when you get into the morality of his character, right? Like, yeah, there were elements of his character that were fantastic. Like, he valued his family. He absolutely did, but he did it in a super toxic way, though. You know what I'm saying? So Anakin has these kind of it's this weird kind of layers to him. Like, there's elements of him where he's a very caring person for Padme, and obviously with his mother and things like that. I mean, those are, for anybody, those are great qualities to have. But then he goes about it, and he's really
his Achilles heel, sort of speak.
But that became his Achilles heel. That became what became really gross about him, and that caused him to do horrendous things. But then ultimately he redeems himself at the very end. He does kind of go back to that family with Luke at the very end, right, where on his deathbed, so to speak. And he, so he's that's why I think as a character, I think he's absolutely phenomenal. But to look at him as like a role model, that's where I'm like, no, dude. Okay, that's where you lose me. That's where you lose me. I think he's a great character. I think there's elements of good in him, absolutely, with really any character, But I think as a role model or something like that, I think that that's not okay.
He's a tragic character,
And I think the perception of how each person views him, a lot of people don't really necessarily. They see two separate characters. Like when you talk about Anakin, it's talking about Anakin. When you say you're talking about Vader, you're talking about Vader, but literally it's the same character. But people don't say, oh, that's Darth Vader, formerly known as Anakin Skywalker. So it's like, it's just Darth Vader, but it's the history and the storyline between the two. And that's where I think if you all say he's a fascinating character and whatever. I literally feel like, I'm going to double down, he is the most fascinating character in the Star Wars universe because of that notion that he literally is basically two characters in one. He has everything. He's the partial of a protagonist that led to his own demise by wanting to be the best protagonist, that it essentially led him to be the antagonist. So, and you get two different feels that when you look at Vader on screen, you're seeing Vader in the moment. Oh, when he's force choking someone, or he's having a lightsaber battle with Obi-Wan Kenobi. But if you literally stop and you say, oh wow, that used to be Anakin Skywalker. That used to be an innocent child who was into pod racing, and he got into the ways of the Jedi at a very young age, and he grew up, under the guidance of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and you just take that whole story arc and then you fast forward it, and it's like, whoa, look what he had become. It's this great dark entity that people look at him and say, oh, he's a badass, he's Darth Vader, but it's much more of a tortured soul, so to speak.
Well, and you bring up a great point about two separate characters, George. You're absolutely right. Like Anakin, died. Anakin Skywalker essentially he died, and Vader was the new. I mean, they are very much different characters, and they talk about that in the films.
Well,
Anakin is no more, and now he's That's fascinating.
I think that not to get overly spiritual, but bear with me on this. I think that, and Bryant, you alluded to this earlier. The reason why I think the character of Anakin resonates with so many people is that, and George doubled down on this, because in the OT, you would say that Anakin is a bad dude. or Vader is a bad dude. But then when you go back and you see the prequel trilogy, you go, oh, he's a horrendous dude. Like, and so George doubled down on this to a certain extent, but in that last scene, in those last scenes of Return of the Jedi, we see a Force ghost Anakin, and that Force ghost Anakin is a redeemed Anakin. However, Bryant, you said this earlier, and I agree with this. There's nothing Anakin can do to redeem himself because he's done too much horrific shit. Like, Anakin has done too much horrific shit to be redeemed of his own behavior. Just throwing Palpatine off the edge is not redemption for a guy who murdered kids, murdered galaxies or systems.
It doesn't balance the scales.
It doesn't balance the scales. It just doesn't. So I think that there's a spiritual component here to Anakin that is like really meaningful to people. So someone like what I believe, because it would be like your worth is not set up on what you've done, but rather what, in this case, the cosmic force, you know what I mean? Like in my sense of spirituality, I would say Jesus Christ, but of course this is the cosmic force. That what the cosmic force has instead done for you, and then you accepting that and saying, oh, okay, well, I'm gonna say, you know what? The dark side was the wrong side, and I'm gonna acknowledge that I am wrong, and I'm in need of redemption, and I just screwed up. Which he does. Like, he literally does that when Luke takes off his helmet. That has a lot of significance for us who think about all the things that we do that are horrific and that we can probably never redeem ourselves from, as much as we might try to. And of course, most of us haven't killed kids, and if you have, you should be in jail. So go report yourself.
Exactly.
But I think that there's some spiritual significance in his journey that makes him a character that we feel a strong degree of association with. I do think, though, that it gets weird for me when people start to talk about him as being the ultimate character and wanting to have more and more stories about him, because at that point you start to say, like, well, his arc is pretty amazing, and there's been a lot of other side arcs and side stories that they've told, but a lot of those stories are, to Brian's other point, they're all part of the tragedy. They're all part of the tragedy that leads us to this one moment where he has to decide, am I going to stick to the dark side, or am I going to realize that I was wrong this whole time? And I need to acknowledge that and let that go. And so I find myself in this place where I go, I love that people love the character, because you should, right? But at the same time, at what point are we loving the character, and why are we loving the character?
We almost need to applaud Filoni for this episode in the restraint used. I think what the key is it's great to love this character. It's great to want more stories, but more stories won't necessarily make you rehab the same experience. Like, the character should be used as needed. He's a powerful character, but he should, like, Star Wars shouldn't just be Anakin Skywalker. And the other thing that I like, and I'll give but I think the sequel trilogy both succeeded a little bit and failed a little bit with this. Mm-hmm. But this is a powerful enough character, especially whether you're talking about Anakin or Vader, that he goes beyond physically appearing in stories, that his legacy, that his mythos carries on. I mean, we see that even in the Ahsoka series, where we didn't need to see Hayden Christensen to have them talking about the legacy of Ahsoka's master, or to have Baylan referring to Anakin and what he became. This is a huge character in the grand scheme of things. One thing I loved about the sequels was this idea that kind of parallels some of the things that you're talking about, Jay, where we have this sort of spiritually lost young man in massive amounts of pain, looking for some sort of guidance, some sort of certainty and finding it in a horrible misinterpretation of what Darth Vader is, what a powerful figure of hate is. And I wish that I feel like there's a lot of that buried in The Force Awakens. I feel like it drains away a little bit as they change direction of where they're going with the other two movies. But that was a really interesting thing. And I think there's still whether it's in other stories in comics or books, I think there's still something to that. I still think there's still something to the idea of what do the horrible actions or the power or mystique of Vader, how does it live on past his death, and how does it influence things that come down the road?
And you do make a good point with that, Brian, because I remember when it showed Kylo Ren basically having a discussion with Vader's helmet with the partial skull inside, and it's like, I'm going to finish what you started. And it was already to the point where, again, where Anakin could have or may not have been somewhat redeemed, but at the same point of time where obviously Leia and Han Solo would have then taught young Ben, hey, this was your grandfather. He was redeemed, but at the same time, with Ben turning over to the dark side, all he saw was a one-track mind of saying, no, this is my grandfather. My grandfather's not Anakin. My grandfather is Darth Vader.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
That is.
Fantastic conversation, guys. As always, is a pleasure. It is a pleasure to have these conversations with you. We got 3 more episodes left. We will be talking through this each time. And we really appreciate that you could join us on this one, Bryant. Why don't you tell the folks where they can find you, where they can learn more about Fanbasepress and read some of your comics?
Sure, excellent. You can follow me on Twitter at Comic Book Slayer. If you're looking for Fanbasepress, we're at fanbasepress.com. Also on Twitter and Facebook as Fanbasepress. Basically a indie comic book publishing website and a geek culture website combined. So you can get lots of free podcasts, reviews, interviews with creators, but also check out our own stories that we produce. If you like Star Wars, I'm sure there's something in our line that will suit your taste. So definitely hop over there and check us out.
And I will say, just as a plug for Bryant, not only Eisner nominated on some of their books that they sell, but also Eisner nominated for being a geek website. So
yes, thank you.
Definitely check that out. Yeah, for sure. Citrus George, where can people find you?
Absolutely. Before I do, really quick, I could just picture Filoni sitting watching our episode saying, wow, I can't believe just that one episode I made. Really? Like, they got that deep. I wish I would have thought of some of that stuff.
But Filoni has an open invitation, by the way. Anytime he wants to come on the show, with the Story Geeks,
yes. Bring the hat.
Yeah.
Come on.
But anyways, you can find me on X at Disney George. If you could check out the podcast I'm part of called A Walk with Walt, we dive into a lot of the rich, nostalgic history of the one, the only, the man, the legend, the myth, Mr. Walt Disney himself. And of course, you can find me here on my home base at Orange Grove 55 with Citrus Corner, with all that sweet, juicy, but sometimes sticky Disney news and info.
Perfect.
I picked up on your emotions this time. I feel pretty good about myself. Admiral OG, tell us where the people can find you and what do you got coming up for us on the channel?
Perfect. We have okay. So coming up on the channel, we actually have a really big guest, and Jay and George, you guys are familiar with this in the DM. So coming up very soon with that. We can't really say quite yet, but that's coming. And we're just going to talk a lot about park stuff and geek out with you in terms of AHSOKA and what have you. So we're going to be doing very Orange Grove 55-y things. But you can find me here on YouTube, Orange Grove 55. You can find me on Instagram now. You know, I guess I'm a Gen Zer now, I guess, right? I'm on Instagram now. It's been like a month, you know, I'm kind of new to the game. And you can also find me on Twitter at Orange Grove 55. You can check me out over there if you want to have good conversations. So yeah, again, Jay, thank you so much for being a gracious host. And Bryant, it's always a privilege and honor to have you on, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And George, absolutely. And George, as always, sir, thank you for joining.
Absolutely. You guys are the best. Find me on X at Jay Sherer. I'm working on right now on how stories work with Jay Sherer. I am working on a short film. I'm going to come out with a table read version of it. The first half of it's coming out this week some point, and then the second half's coming out probably next month. And then the actual film, the actual short film, fully realized, will probably be out early next year. So go check out How Stories Work with Jay Sherer, and you can find that stuff over there. Absolute pleasure, gentlemen. Don't be Kylo Ren about Vader. but appreciate the Vader character for how great the Vader character is. We will see you guys next time. Leave your comments down below. Let us know all about, is this a Mortis thing? Was that really Anakin? Is this the world between worlds? Let us know in the comments down below. And thank you for joining us for this conversation. See you next week.